let's get underway. Thank you all for joining us and for being part of, I've lost track of years, but I think that might be the 13th annual Yale Philanthropy Conference. It's an entirely student organized event, and they pull in some of us on the faculty to help out here and there, but we are really their servants. They are the masterminds behind it. And this year, as you've probably heard, there's over 1,200 people who registered. So it's great. So this panel, as you know, is focused on balancing risk and achieving impact. Part of this whole reimagining philanthropy theme is investigating, among other topics, how to invest in systemic change. Recognizing that assessing systemic change can be challenging and that it seems to be riskier to invest in compared to other kinds of activities that have a more clear or immediate way of gauging benefit. So the overarching challenge really is, how should philanthropists balance that increased risk against what we've called the moral urgency of systemic change? How can funders ensure impact and accountability among the organizations they support without playing it so safe that we're neglecting the longer term, less measurable perhaps, but morally urgent kinds of change? So we have the next hour and a half or so, although a panel is listed officially to end at 12:30, we have really until 1 o'clock before the next formal event, which is the next keynote. And we're happy to stay here to the extent there's interest among our participants. So I'm going to make very short introductions of our three esteemed panelists, and then the order of business will, we have a few questions to pose to them and encouraging them to engage with each other. And then we'll leave time for questions and answers towards the end of our first hour for those of you who do need to move on at 12:30, and then we'll continue the question and answer session through until 1 or until people have found other things to do. So it's a real privilege to welcome this group of people. And we've intentionally kept it small with just 3 in order to make it more interactive. So just in alphabetical order, Norma Altshuler is a program officer in the Global Development and Population Program at the Hewlett Foundation. She focuses on the use of data and evidence to improve public policies in developing countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Before coming to Hewlett, Norma helped start the Global Innovation Fund, and before that was a portfolio manager with USAID's very innovative venture called the Development Innovation Venture. Subarna Mathis is Senior Strategy and Evaluation Officer at the Ford Foundation. Before joining Ford, Subarna worked with the Open Society Foundation looking at the same issues around learning and impact. And before that, she was a consultant. And Maya Winkelstein is the founding CEO of Open Road Alliance, which is perhaps a less known organization than Ford Foundation or Hewlett Foundation. Open Road Alliance is a hybrid philanthropic and investment initiative focused on advancing what they call solutions to keep impact on track. And specifically, Open Road only enters in to funding when organizations encounter unexpected roadblocks. So it's a quite interesting approach to philanthropy. Since it was launched in 2012, Open Road has made over $40 million in grants and low interest loans to organizations in many different sectors. So I'm going to stop there, and then maybe we'll just continue. How about in reverse alphabetical order? We've asked each of our panelists to spend 5 minutes just describing themselves, their organization, their general thoughts before we dive into our questions. So Maya, please.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you so much for having me, and to everybody who is joining us this Friday afternoon. As Tony mentioned, Open Road is a private initiative, nearly 10 years old now, and what I think is relevant for the conversation today and why we are participating is, as Tony described, our purpose is to intervene in moments of unexpected roadblocks for organizations focused on impact, whether that's through a for-profit model or a non-for-profit model. And for the purpose of today's conversation, a good way to think about unexpected roadblocks is unexpected roadblocks are risks realized. So things go wrong all the time in the world. The world is unpredictable, and the reality is that the impact world is not immune to that unpredictability. So whether it's macro events like currency fluctuations or public health crises and global pandemics, or whether it's more individual challenges such as partner problems or logistics or supply chain management, this affects the impact sector as well. And we've spent the last 10 years not just intervening to help organizations in these situations, but also then from that portfolio and from that experience, trying to look at some of the greater trends of why is it that the social sector, the philanthropic sector, isn't as good as managing these risks in advance or as responding to these risks when they are realized as other sectors in the corporate and for-profit world. So I'm looking forward to speaking to that today.
Thanks, Maya. Subarna?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Andrew, working, I know, behind the scenes for making this all happen. And hello to everyone virtually. I'm, as Tony mentioned, at the Ford Foundation, working in a unit relatively new for Ford, and certainly the first of its kind at Ford, though this has been, though all things strategy, learning, impact have been questions we've been asking since our inception. But I do sit in a unit called the Office of Strategy and Learning, and we do work with programs on strategy development, ongoing monitoring and learning, and then evaluation, which is why I'm really excited to be part of this panel, because it is a risk, mitigating risk and impact are all questions very much in our world when we work with programs. Couple of things to note relative to the work that we're doing at Ford since Darren Walker assumed the presidency in late 2013. Our mission has been to address the drivers of inequality in the issues that we work on. No small feat, even to call them addressing and not solving them. And inherently, part of that conversation is questions around structural inequality, questions around power, who has it, who doesn't, and how we shift it, and lots of definitional questions that we come up with. You know, what impact for whom, impact, what is impact and for whom, what is risk and for whom. So really excited to dig into some of what we're learning, how we're positioning some of these conversations when we get going in the question and discussion. And just happy to be here.
Great. Thank you, Subarna. Norma?
Thanks, Tony, and thanks so much to you and Andrew and the Yale team for convening this conversation. I wanted to say a few words about Hewlett to sort of situate the perspective that I'm bringing. Hewlett's defining values include outcomes-oriented philanthropy, but much of our work is really around the kind of systems change that really brings into tension the kinds of questions that, that Tony just called out. So at the same time as we're striving for outcomes-oriented philanthropy, we also have a lot of characteristics you might not associate with that, like a real commitment to long-term support for organizations. Some of our partners have been with us for more than 50 years, and the foundation is only 54 years old. And also, we are often pursuing change that is around building a field that is going to respond to a lot of problems, some including outcomes we might not even anticipate at the start, and robust organizations that will do the same. We also pride ourselves on collaborative and flexible relationships with grantees, and just being really humble about the fact that our grantee partners are almost always closer to the problems we're trying to solve and the realities of what will and won't work than we do. So really sort of trying to make sure that we are not pushing, not only are we not pushing solutions, but even in some cases, we're really sort of deferring on what the priority problems are to our partners. So all of this is to say, I'm really excited to hopefully emerge with some new ideas, but also share some of what we're learning about how one can keep outcomes central and make funding decisions that are based on thinking about long-term outcomes at the same time as really providing flexibility and supporting changing in systems.
Great, thank you. And somebody sent me a note saying I should introduce myself as well. So very briefly, I'm Tony Sheldon. I am on the faculty at the Yale School of Management, and I'm the executive director of the school's program on social enterprise. My background before Yale was in international economic development, primarily, especially financial services. So let's start off. How much risk should philanthropists tolerate in pursuit of lasting systemic change? There's a number of risks to look in. There's the risk of not doing harm, or Norma referred to unanticipated outcomes. How do we know if something doing actually is not being constructive, as well as the risks around not achieving the impacts that we're trying to focus on? So I'm going to ask this of all three of our panelists, and let's start with Subarna. How does Ford grapple with these issues? The creation of your unit, I imagine, is one part of it. And again, it's, since Darren Walker, as you said, came in, inequality is what Ford now, through every dollar spent, is meant to address. So it's a pretty tricky one to monitor and evaluate. So please enlighten us.
And by enlighten, you mean grapple with the questions that we are much in the space of doing. So it is a really salient question for us. One of the things that is a little bit freeing is that because we have purported to work on addressing the drivers of inequality, we're not, and a lot of things that Norma mentioned in her opening remarks, Ford follows as well. When you're, I'll finish that first thought, which is once you've talked about addressing the drivers of inequality in your mission statement, it frees you up from having to use the same goalposts, metrics that really others continue to use. I mean, we are asking such fundamental questions of, like I mentioned before, who does have the power to make decisions? Who does around what our strategies are? Who does have the power to make decisions around how and to whom we grant make and for how long and what nature of that grant making is? And then fundamentally, and at the end of that, who really is able to be part of the conversation of what impact looks like? What is it that we're achieving? So a lot of how we at least try and mitigate any historically and preconceived notions around what risk is and what impact is to have longer term strategies. Again, Norma at Hewlett and a lot of resonance with what we're doing at Ford. They're an outcomes oriented philanthropy. We still call ourselves a strategic philanthropy, and yet balancing that tension with being a social justice philanthropy is where that piece we're grappling with really resides. So to I guess mitigate some of that, we're really looking at 10-year strategies. None of this will be earth-shattering, but we're looking at 10-year strategies with a 5-year midpoint. So 2 cycles of strategy at 5-year increments, where because we come from that same perspective of this is complex social change we're working on, we do not have the answers. Our partners have the experience, and to the extent that they have the answers and or ideas that they want to test, that's who we're supporting, and who are front in sort of engaging and grappling with those questions. So we really check in all along the way. This is where our monitoring, the what we monitor is really important, but we're really trying to establish less widget type monitoring, less these are the declarative output oriented things. That we have those as illustrative examples, but really what we're actually trying to understand on an ongoing basis between the 5-year, within the 5-year cycles, as well as at the end of that 10-year strategy, is really our understanding of how change happened. What did we learn about the assumptions we were making, how change happened, and enough along the way that we can make pivots, so that we're not investigating this or asking this question at the end of that 10 years in a sort of ex post kind of way, but really on an ongoing basis, so that what we're doing is feeding that learning real time as much as possible into the development and the refinement of our strategies. Maybe I'll stop there, and then we'll have others come in, and then we can continue.
Great. Yeah, I can think of lots of things to ask you about in terms of follow-up. Let's turn to Norma first, and then Maya. Norma, how does Hewlett grapple with this, and how do you grapple with this?
Thanks, Tony. I think when it comes to the big picture question you opened with, how much risk should philanthropy be willing to take in terms of impact? I think, and I suspect I'm preaching to the choir here, we should be completely prepared to fail and even have no impact if the ultimate payoff is big enough, and if we're being smart and strategic about whether we're actually on track to get there. I think coming back to both that and the risks you mentioned around harms, one sort of counterintuitive way I've learned about mitigating risk, which is congruent with what Subarna just said, is that flexible support, counterintuitively, giving up control can actually help funders mitigate risk. So starting with harm, I think at Hewlett we do and should take this seriously. And it's especially salient for me because the work that I'm doing is primarily about improving outcomes in East and West Africa, which I am both literally and figuratively half a world away from. And so the secret weapons that I think we have here are around the flexible support, but also around finding values aligned and contextually grounded organizations, much like Ford. For example, changing norms around women's roles is one thing that many people have suggested we might want to do. That if we could play a role in supporting different attitudes about women's roles and capacities, could have huge impact for things like women's economic empowerment and reproductive freedom. And I'm sure you can also imagine a million ways that anything that I dream up could backfire on this. But African organizations are much closer to the context and much better prepared to understand and navigate, is there a risk of doing harm? So if we have some narrative about reproductive autonomy for women is going to increase family harmony and that backfires, they can try something else. I think when it comes back to the outcome question, this also helps with sort of mitigating the risk of not having impact if we're flexible. And for example, and I think this applies both if you're a bit more targeted about the kind of change you're hoping to seek, as I think Hewlett is a little more than Ford, and also if you're in Ford's shoes and quite flexible. So for example, during COVID at Hewlett, in some of the work that I do, we really are quite focused on increasing African government's use of evidence. That's really sort of something that we see as a long-term goal we're structured on versus many other worthy goals our partners might pursue. But when we give organizations flexibility about how to promote that ongoing goal, then they can pivot very quickly. So for example, during COVID, there were a lot of plans that folks had laid out that were totally irrelevant or infeasible. And instead, because our grantee partners had flexibility, they started doing things like helping the government of Uganda figure out how you could implement social distancing in slums faster than we could have renegotiated a grant agreement or write a new check. So I think, when it comes, just in closing on this, when it comes to how specific you are about outcomes, whether your goal is something like power shift, like Subarna described, or whether your goal is we want to improve learning education in South Africa, at least having flexibility about the tactics and the activities is important. And when you have flexibility about even certain of the goals, are we trying to improve education or health, then you can actually learn a lot from partners about where the opportunities are.
Great introductory diving in, and lots to build on. Maya, please.
Yes, I really appreciate the comments from both Subarna and Norma, and I just want to build on them a little bit and actually sort of peel back the layers of some of what they shared and get to something that I think is even a deeper root issue than this basic question of how much risk should funders be taking. And that really comes back to what is risk? What do we mean by that word? And you know, I like to say that the concept of risk today in philanthropy is in the same level of sophistication that the concept of impact was 15 years ago. We all used the word, we all said we had it, but nobody could actually prove it quantitatively or qualitatively. We didn't even have the distinction between outputs, outcomes, and impact. And that's really what risk is today. So I agree with everything that Subarna and Norma has said, but I do think there's a nuance here that we need to separate, and that is what Norma was just talking about in terms of when we're talking about risk defined as things not going according to plan. That is the objective definition of risk. It's risk as a noun, if you will, right? It's risk as substitute for uncertainty. And when dealing with that objective reality that things don't go according to plan, no matter what the plan is, Norm is exactly right. Flexibility is sort of the obvious approach to dealing with that. Flexibility, resiliency, and specifically in philanthropy, we already have a bunch of tools, as they pointed out, to our disposal. Multi-year grants, unrestricted grants, thinking about measuring, monitoring and evaluation in a different context that is based on resiliency and long-term gains rather than short-term annual budgets. And that's all around dealing with uncertainty, or to put it in the risk framework, maybe we could call that risk management, right? It's this objective reality, no matter what, the world's unpredictable. It doesn't matter who you were, what your strategy was, COVID affected you, right? That's just the world. But there's another side of risk. There's another definition of risk, which plays into that and plays into how we approach this question, which is the subjective definition of risk. And that is the question you asked with risk as a verb: how much risk should we take? And that definition of risk, unlike the objective reality that stuff happens, the question of what is, quote, risky, and what risk should we take as investors, is a question of our risk tolerance. It's a question of our risk appetite. And that is an entirely subjective frame. Just like in the financial markets, right, there is no one right risk tolerance. Investing in Tesla stock is not inherently better than investing in municipal bonds. They speak to different strategies based on different risk tolerances, based on different goals. It's the same in philanthropy, right? Every funder, institutional or individual, has a risk appetite, has an innate risk tolerance that is based on experience, based on values, based on a lot of subjective assumptions, based on bias, implicit and explicit, that makes us even determine, before we get to managing the objective risks that happen, managing that uncertainty, that are informing our strategy up front and what we even think is risky or not. Is investing in small organizations that haven't only been around for 3 years, like, why is that risky, right? What are the core assumptions built into that makes us attach that subjective value judgment on top of that? So I think teasing that out is something that's really important to this question, because ultimately, how much risk should philanthropists take? I don't care. Philanthropists are going to be everywhere along the risk spectrum. Some people are more risk taking, some people are more risk averse. So I don't think there's a perfect place that we need to be. What I think we need to do, though, is recognize where we are, be honest and very transparent with ourselves and the rest of the world where we are, how we define that, and so we can then follow that in to everything that Subarna and Norma have been speaking out about in terms of then implementing a strategy and dealing with the world and those sort of objective uncertainties as they are.
Thank you. Yeah, and as
Can I add something?
please.
I completely agree with you, Maya. And I think the other important thing is being, for both people within funding institutions and people trying to navigate them, is just understanding the political economy of the institution, what risks affect different levels of decision makers, and when possible, how to educate and sort of convince some of those decision makers to think a little differently. So for example, at Hewlett, we are very, very blessed with a board that is very open to failure and doesn't even necessarily define things didn't work out and now we're doing something different as failure. And many institutions have very different enabling environments. And I think that funders can really play a role in supporting each other, and grantee partners can play a role as well in showcasing new ideas and really unpacking and understanding the attitudes of individuals that we can help move along.
Great, yeah. And as our audience can probably tell, we've chosen people for this panel who both, I think, individually and institutionally represent risks, a high tolerance for uncertainty and a willingness to grapple with these kinds of risks. That said, how do you all look at how do you ask the organizations that you support and the initiatives that you underwrite to demonstrate progress to you? If it's not success or these outputs, how do you gauge if they're doing well and therefore if you're doing well, or when you need to pivot? So let me start with Norma on that, and then Subarna.
Thanks, Tony. I think this is one of my favorite topics and one that I'm especially eager to get other views on. So thank you for the question. I think that both funders and grantees need to talk a lot less about outputs and worry a lot less about whether we can measure, whether we have measures we can track, and a lot more about whether we're using contextual knowledge and sound professional judgment to look at the links to our long-term goals. So around 5 or 6 years ago, Bridgespan wrote a paper that many of you may have seen, saying that to evaluate advocacy efforts, you should think of yourself as a foreign intelligence analyst. You basically never have certainty, but you get a lot of contextual information and make reasoned judgments. And I think the same mindset applies to both working on thinking about systems change, and even sometimes to thinking about direct impact. We're trying to increase education outcomes. We're trying to reduce maternal mortality when you're working on those things on long time frames. So for example, in my work, lots of our partners want to transform how governments use evidence. This is a big, ambitious systems change. And honestly, I spend a lot of time reading reports about how somebody published 10 policy briefs, or that did 500 presentations, or had a paper downloaded 5,000 times. And I just don't think that that's the best use of our partners' time or of mine. But what is helpful is when our partners help me see the link to direct impact. So when it comes to like a specific policy change, our grantee partners usually have a ton of contextual knowledge about whether a solution is likely to be adopted and implemented well. So for example, is an education research project have any shot of leading to better learning outcomes? Things that help are understanding, for example, the government counterpart is one of the minister's closest advisors, and the solution is pretty feasible. It's easy to implement, doesn't cost more, and that this particular partner has a decent track record of having pronouncements on high about what education policy is going to be, to, in this particular government, actually rolling them out. This helps me understand how a program could have direct impact. And I even think there are really sort of cutting edge ways that we've seen a little of and would love to see more of getting quantitative about how likely is success and what will the learning outcomes be if we happen. And then when it comes to systems change, I think this kind of contextual knowledge is even more important. For example, we've gotten the ministry excited about using data on an ongoing basis. They're calling us now. And we've helped them set up a new evidence unit, and this is paving the way for them to seriously consider building data and evidence systems. And that's why it's on track towards systems change. You might be thinking, like, isn't this all gameable? Isn't this just sort of a, the kind of thing that the grantees could game? And I think that, that can be true. And I have some ideas I'd love to chat more about sort of creating good incentives and ways to verify. But I think even more importantly, I think that if we want to create systems change, this sort of learning orientation around let's focus on outcomes and support organizations in learning whether they're on track to do so is really sort of the best way of thinking about building ongoing learning towards change. So if you take just one thing away from this long answer, I hope it's that to consider the link between the foreign intelligence analyst approach, both if you're a funder or a doer, which can help us understand if we're on track, but also what barriers we have to overcome.
Thank you. Anna?
Yeah, no, this is also a topic near and dear. Lots of resonance as well with what Norma just shared. I mean, for us at Ford, we're grappling with, and this is a tension that we are grappling with. Really thinking we are not necessarily on the side of the spectrum where we have gone to trust-based, what is known as trust-based philanthropy. So we do have proposal and reporting. Not that those are opposites. And we are increasingly thinking about, because like Hewlett, we have partners who are with us for not just one project or a 1-year budget cycle, that they are with us in many ways over the course of multiple years, sometimes many years. What we are looking to do is ask questions exactly to Norma's point about, and we say this a lot because we've tried and walked away from theory of change, which has come to mean almost everything and kind of nothing, but really to understand how change happens alongside them. So rather than asking questions where we are also acknowledging how much power we bring to the conversation about, like, tell us what happened, in a way that is very unidirectional, where they can't actually engage us back in conversation and say, well, frankly, we thought we would do this, it didn't work out, and this is how we pivoted, this is what we tried next. And for us not to lead with only report on the things that we agreed you would report on, but to really start with what were the questions that were coming up for you? What did you expect to achieve based on the understanding that we had, based on our ongoing support? Again, we do a lot of general support. We're increasingly a bulk of our grant making. I'm almost going to say majority of our grant making is now general support. What we want to have are those conversations, much more than here's the out. Again, similar to Norma, we're not interested in how many meetings someone had with someone else or research papers produced. We care about that in the service of some change that happened, and that can be intermediate change. That can be, a set of folks who were previously opposed to some policy or practice, who have now shown through whatever mechanism, through published sort of talking points, et cetera, that they are moving their stance. But we are trying as much as possible to not be declarative at the outset, and then also at the moment of re-granting or reissuing and re-upping, that is something that is contingent also upon further funding. So really trying to take away the like the us knowing, give us the answer, tell us what you've done, much more by a two-way conversation, because half of the time, and I would not even say half, more than half, maybe all of the time, we don't know. And I think to start from that place of humility of we need to learn from our partners who are working on this every single day, what they are learning and how we can better support them. And that then fundamentally changes the what we measure along the way.
can just jump on that, I think what Subhana said is so true, and it's amazing in our work, the research that we've done over the years, surveying nonprofits around when something does go wrong, right? When things don't go according to plan, what have you done? What has your communication been with your funder? Do they even hear about it? And I always, the kind of most common thing we hear is, one, we're afraid. Like, no, we don't talk to our funders because we're afraid. And so I think the power dynamics that Subhana is talking to is so critical here, to actually being able to address these issues. And then the second thing, which Subhana also mentioned around reporting, is that question in sort of standard question in final report templates. Please tell us any challenges you encountered during the grant period and what you did to overcome them, right? And I always laugh now when I see that or hear about that question, because first of all, it's a day late and a dollar short, right? It's like you're walking out of your final exam and your teacher says, by the way, any issues with the material this semester? It's like it's too late. And then secondly is, again, with the power dynamics, we actually looked into a potential research project where we were going to go and actually read the answers that grantees actually put into that at a number of foundations and see if we could glean insights. But when we started to do that, we had to abandon the project because the answers were basically just what I like to call the job interview answers. What's your weakness? I care too much. I work too hard. And it was like, what are the challenges you encountered? Oh, well, maybe here's a little challenge, but look how amazing we were, and we're so good, and therefore you need to give us money again. So it's just to kind of put a finer point on that. I completely agree.
So let me fold in some of the questions that are coming in along the way that relate to some of the topics now. I think maybe partly inspired by Maya's discussion of sort of portfolio management, but do you all look at each potential initiative, partnership, as certainly in its own right, but do you try to have like a spread of risk and say, oh, this one, we know these guys, we've been working with them for 4 years, they can grapple with this, and then this one, boy, they're really way out there? Or do you say, each one has the same sense? Like, do you take a portfolio approach or a unit by unit approach? So Maya, since you're actually coming into inherently risky situations, maybe you can respond, and then Norma and Subhana, how you approach that.
Sure. So the first thing I would say is that, even though we're coming in a moment when something has gone wrong, we've actually found over the years that our intervention is actually very low risk from an investor standpoint. We're coming in when something goes wrong, but we're coming in when something exogenous outside of the control has gone wrong. And what's interesting is most nonprofits out there, social enterprises, when things go wrong, they actually do know how to fix them. So the challenge isn't that it went wrong. The challenge is that they have nowhere else to turn because funders don't move fast enough, because grants are restricted, because budget cycles don't operate on a rolling basis. And I'd like to say a broken water main does not wait 6 months for the board to meet for a grant docket. It's just not how the real world works. So that's just something to note. And so to answer your question, in that, I think that's actually a perfect example of, yes, it is a portfolio approach. We have, in retrospect, definitely recognized, I'd say certainly looking at our loan portfolio. So we have grants and we have loans. So the loan portfolio, there is certainly, from a financial perspective, we do want to get repaid, very traditional risk buckets and sort of a range of likelihood of repayments, not. What's interesting is overlaying that with, exactly as you were describing, sort of what is the impact risk portfolio. And there, for us, it's actually less a question of, do we think that this impact is going to happen or not? Because again, the nature of our capital it's bridge financing, essentially. So that's where it's low risk, in that it's always, you know, if there isn't a bridge, they're not going to get our money anyway. So the bridge is always there. The question for us is how catalytic, how big is the impact, right? So you can think about a loan that is very financially secure, but the impact, yeah, it's good. There's no question it's good. There's no question it's not doing harm, but it's probably not system changing. Maybe it's not going to reach that many people. Versus on the other hand, we'll then look at that sort of matrix portfolio of saying, you know what, it's not the most solid financial deal, but the impact here is really critical, right? This is an organization that is otherwise going to go out of business, or this is a key moment in that organization where if they are able to bridge through this obstacle, they're going to be able to have this, you know, system changing or this really catalytic growth that justifies that. So it does play off of it. The portfolio approach plays off in both ways.
The programmatic and the financial. So let me turn to Subarna on this and wrinkle as well, because you all do grants, you do program-related investments. Now you've got a huge amount set aside for mission-related investments, plus you've done a bond to raise further money. So how does do you look at different risk assessments based on the kind of financing as well as the kind of initiative? How do you juggle all that from the Office of Evaluation and Learning?
I think you're expanding our remit a little bit. I mean, part of this is actually a very live question for us. In full honesty, full disclosure, our MRI, mission-related investment work, used to be even further. They're a bit more in kind of associated with our programmatic work now, but they've typically, for all the reasons that Maya talked about, they are typically seen as a different animal and beast than the sort of program philanthropy side of things. So, I might not have a satisfying response there. What we are asking questions about, particularly with respect to the social justice bond, and we can come back to that, the social bond, is especially given that the majority or a huge percentage of our social bond investment is to existing grantees, existing partners. How do we what can we learn about the unique impact of the bond relative to the programmatic and or other general supports that they're receiving to do business as usual pre-COVID? Is there something we can say that is a unique contribution of the fund? Is it even worth asking that question? I mean, half of my business is asking, like, is it worth asking this question and investing a ton of resources in a question that the answer doesn't really give us anything to take forward. So, but that is a very live question for us. More broadly speaking, into the question asked by the attendee, absolutely, we take a portfolio/ecosystem approach. So we look at all of our grantees in the kind of the sub strategies or the sub program areas that we have. So our mass incarceration work in the US, for example, the program team is not making one-off grants without thinking about the system more broadly, whether that's at the state level, at the national level, and even at the local level. And we absolutely have those conversations, and our program team are really good about having the conversations around what does support look like to quote unquote, anchor organizations in the field, those organizations who've like historically led work or are the absence of whom will really, really have dire consequences for the field. And also to ask that opposite question of, and this our build program, which I think many of you will know about, which is our $1 billion 5-year investment that's about to be re-upped as well, around support, general support, multi-year support, institutional strengthening to our quote unquote core or anchor partners. It's really thinking about also the unintended consequences, which I think either Norma or Maya brought up, to make sure that those anchor partners are also our support, and signaling our support to these quote unquote anchor partners isn't actually having undue perverse effects on the system. So who are we squeezing out when we support these bigger organizations? Are we actually closing, to take it back to risk, are we actually denying resources, opportunities to the scrappier organizations, the newer organizations that frankly could use our support as much, if not more, in their moment, in their sort of cycle. So a lot of question asking, and I think it's in the question, it just even what I found in all of our work, and I'm sure, I hope Maya and Norma will agree, that I think it's even asking the question, and again, not assuming things are like this is objective truth, is very much where we are almost in all of our programming.
Norma, on this sort of portfolio approach?
Thanks, Tony. I think that it's not necessarily important to me or to Hewlett philosophically to be taking a portfolio approach. And we have some portfolios where the whole thing is very high risk. But when it comes to the practical realities of how to best advance a goal and learn, I often find that it's helpful. And particularly that it's helpful to have some work with much faster, shorter feedback loops, even if as at the same time as you're doing long-term systems change. So for example, in our work on women's economic empowerment, we have some work that is very, very long-term and ambitious, like let's transform norms around who takes care, around distribution of unpaid labor, and let's have paid childcare in African countries, and then at scale. And that sort of work is, I think, helpful to be coupled with things like, we have a social protection program that isn't reaching, that's disproportionately leaving out women. Let's make that program 10% more likely to reach women. And when we have that mix, we're both sort of hedging our bets about, as we're learning about the potential of the different kinds of change, but also we're getting really useful feedback from the more practical short-term work about what it takes to move different stakeholders. And we hope also generating momentum that can maybe lead to longer-term systems change.
Norma, I'm going to pick on you a little bit more just because there's a question that's very much your wheelhouse, and obviously others are welcome to add in. Do you think it's the role of private philanthropy to de-risk potential solutions so that government funders can then come to the table? Because a lot of your portfolio specifically is really working with government.
Mm-hmm. I think that that is definitely a useful role for philanthropy, and that there are certainly plenty of examples of philanthropy as a space for innovation, of trying new approaches, like, remedial education is one particularly close to my heart, that was, particularly when done in partnership with governments, can really sort of then spark change and spark scale up. But I also think it's important that, we think broadly about different roles, and that philanthropy also has a really unique role to play in terms of supporting challenges to government approaches. And sometimes there are just really high impact gaps that the government's not filling, that we can just sort of take care of and achieve impact that way.
Anybody want to chime in on the sort of philanthropy government exchange interface? Okay. So a couple of questions have come in. I lose track because you're all saying such great things, but I think it was Subarnu who talked about sort of the large players and the small players, and how do you ensure you're not, by supporting great work by large organizations, that you're not squeezing out the scrappy ones. So how do these smaller organizations get your attention? What sort of opportunities or avenues are there for them to even get onto the table so you'd look at them? How both for your own organization, but what sort of guidance might you have for the smaller organizations, in the trenches with deep local contextual knowledge? Subarna, why don't we start?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and particularly for Ford and for philanthropy in general as an elite structure where people have access or they don't. You know, we've been grappling with this. Part of it is our program, like our program level staff. So our program staff are really charged with being the conduits to knowing what is going on with respect to their fields. They're not going to know it all or anything, not like as similar to what is the case for any of us, but they, through their partners, through their networks, are really always trying to ensure that what we're doing is, first, of course, asking the question, who are we? Are we squeezing out dissenting voices in particular? Like, are there different perspectives? Are there different perspectives that we should be supporting? So it's not just towing one line about any particular issue, but really, how do we actually fund perhaps a broad spectrum of perspectives on a particular issue? I'm thinking of, in particular, our work on either natural resources and climate change, our work on mass incarceration in the US, frankly, our arts work in the US also, and maybe I'll continue on that example. It depends a little bit on the issue area. What we do is a bit of a mix of open calls in terms of funding. So how do we, particularly for our arts program, lots of open calls to ensure that we're actually getting proposals from and or ideas from folks that we don't already know necessarily. So there's that to mix in with the folks we do know, and increasingly our program staff, particularly in the arts program, are really looking at the non-mainstream institutions. So who are those institutions? The non-Metropolitan Museum of Art, not to call them out, but the non-big players, the people of color in particular, because we focus on diversifying the art space. Our program, Cultural and Free Expression, is working on diversifying the art space. It's really thinking about how do we, again, looking through open calls for proposals, get at a fuller picture of individuals, organizations who are not part of the mainstream in order to be able to support them. And then the next question is, what is the support, right? Because then it becomes not uniform support, but it is tailored support to where they are in sort of, and what they need.
I'd like to pick up on this thread that Subarna mentioned, particularly, this is actually a question that we've been wrestling with ourselves. And I do think that something that Subarna mentioned is really key to this, which is, frankly, a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. And I think one of the ways that I think is really critical to think about this question of why doesn't the little guy, right, whoever the little guy is based on the context, and the context varies, right? In the arts community in New York, it means one thing. Looking at East Africa and educational organizations, it means something completely different. Looking, in agriculture in Latin America, it's all very different, but there is I think a fundamental question around access and then decision making and the support that actually come back to this risk question, right? And we all know the numbers, right? We all know the statistics about money going to large groups. We know the statistics about money going to white-led organizations here in the US over organizations led by communities of color, even if the work is being done in and for that community of color. The same thing is true internationally. If you look at money going to American-based organizations doing work in sub-Saharan Africa, led by white Americans or white expats versus local Africans, this plays out over and over and over. we also all know that a really driving force in that is implicit bias. It just is. And that then speaks back to the risk question, right? Why is it risky? Why does it feel, if we're honest with ourselves, we're truly honest with ourselves, why does it feel riskier to give money to the Black woman who grew up in Harlem, who's doing that small footprint project, than to the white Ivy League graduate who has connections to power? And interrogating that, that's not, and that question of is that risky is very different from those objective risks of what is the likelihood that the pipe is going to burst? What is the likelihood that there will be election violence? What is the likelihood of XYZ happening? You think about the Allstate commercials, Mayhem and State Farm, right? Those are the things, no matter what you decide about, that this subjective risk, that stuff is still going to exist. But it's that I think is at the root of this, and I do think it's one of the questions about risk. And Subarna said, risk for what kind of risk for whom? And who is really taking, what are you really risking? And I do think that's something that we have to interrogate deeply as power holders and asset holders, because that's always what we're deciding is who gets our money. At its core, grants, MRIs, impact investing, we're a one-trick horse. It's $1. And we got to be honest with ourselves about that.
I completely agree. And I think that many private philanthropic organizations, including Hewlett, is truly having a moment around this, and staff are really truly grappling with what are our personal biases and also what are our institutional structures that constrain us. So for example, Hewlett is committed to lean staffing, and that really does constrain our ability, and to only being in California. And so that really constrains our ability to network, understand communities, and write lots of smaller checks to smaller organizations. So I think in terms of practical advice for smaller groups trying to navigate this, I would say, first of all, understand the influencers, networks, and people who the organizations you're trying to secure funding from work with and listen to. Understand that there is a moment about diversity and really a little more willingness to listen and be challenged on that than there was a year ago, although we still have huge amounts of work to do, and help be part of structural solutions that make it easier to overcome some of the institutional constraints. So for example, we often work with regranters because of our institutional constraints. Those have pros and also can perpetuate terrible dynamics. And one thing we have tried to do is listen to the regranters' grantees and really understand how this can be structured in a way that is as empowering and as decolonized as possible. And so I think that, there really is a moment for smaller organizations to come up with other solutions, maybe even help start new regranting organizations that address some of these concerns. I think the final thing I'll say, and this comes back to the earlier question around sort of the role for philanthropy and crowding in governments, is that a big part of some of the grants that I have been able to make to African institutions have been around positioning them to secure funding from other donors who may care less about diversity and to governments. And I think that that's another interesting route for philanthropy to secure, even as we still have a lot of work to do to further diversify our own portfolios. How can we help smaller institutions crowd in other funding?
Great, thank you. So I think you've each touched on this, but I just want to sort of lay a sort of firmer or clearer plumb line around this specific issue around how do you navigate these tensions in a way that is structured and transparent internally, but also externally, or how could this be done better? Touching on a lot of the things that you've done, but how do you think through a process that is structured and transparent and leads to this kind of richer learning and support for unproven ideas addressing systemic issues. Maya, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I'm going to take the opportunity to make a shameless plug for a publication that we put out a couple of years ago called, it's the Risk Toolkit for Addressing Risk in Philanthropy. And it literally has the 10-step process on how you can structure and codify everything we've kind of talked about. How do you define your risk profile, i.e. what your appetite for risk is. We actually think, to your structure point and codification question, every foundation should have a risk statement. Like, it should have a risk profile. These are the risks. This is how we think about risk. These are the risks we're willing to take. These are the ones we're not willing to take. This is how much failure we're willing to accept. This is how we define failure. Again, if you think about it in a market context, we have rating systems for a reason. We know that certain investments, certain models of investment are riskier than others, and they're going to fit better or worse with investors that have higher tolerance for risk or lower tolerance for risk. That market dynamic is true in philanthropy. There are, again, objectively, projects that maybe have more variables of things that could go wrong than others. And there are funders that have different tolerance levels. But because there is no data and there is no transparent discussion about that, it's very hard to do the matchmaking. So for funders, something I think very straightforward that honestly can help also them is to write those risk profile statements. You can get into all the subjective stuff we were talking about, implicit bias. You can keep it high level, but just start the process. And then other things that Norma and Subarna have talked about, flexibility, your budgeting process. There's a lot of steps, practical steps that funders can take in order to structurally and transparently address risk in their grant making, and do so in a way that is, again, intentional. So that would be my one big pitch. I think for the question around sort of a structured way to create some global pipeline to get smaller organizations into the pipeline. I don't know if I think there is sort of a global silver bullet solution there. I do think for a lot of these issues, it is we have to meet each other halfway. And given the power dynamics, I do think that funders have the responsibility to take the first steps. So things that other panelists have described as the steps they're taking, I'd like to see other funders doing that as well.
Thanks. Subarna, any further thoughts on the process of balance tensions around systemic change, monitoring, and particularly being transparent and systematic about it?
Yeah, I think what I realize about doing sort of often bounded, or what was previously known as more bounded monitoring and evaluation work in a place that is increasingly looking at both within Ford but also in the world complex social change. What Maya noted about codification is super important. It sounds mundane, but I think just having, we focus a lot on having conversations, on making sure that we're checking in with our partners, that we're both in while I'll be honest, we don't have strategies developed side by side with grantees. We don't. We do strategies in-house. But that's not to say that we don't consult and partner with and learn from, in particularly the problem definition and opportunities scoping, all of those things with our partners, grantees, and other key actors. And so it's checking in at all of those moments along the way that is part of our making the implicit explicit and making the tacit less so that what we are saying both from strategy design to implementation, and within the implementation, monitoring, learning, and evaluation, that we're really always starting with what are the assumptions we're making, and checking in with our partners about how they see it play out. Not us sitting in New York, but how are our partners actually understanding change to be happening? And then that is the piece that we're really excited about, both further documenting, sharing, and then bringing that into, because we take a life cycle approach to our strategies, to that next strategy cycle, right? So that ongoing learning actually gets fed back into our strategy refreshes.
Great. Norma, any additional thoughts on this?
I think, I'll be honest, Tony, I realized as I was thinking about this question that I don't understand enough about the questions and concerns and ambiguities that my field may have about Hewlett. So I think the first step for me, and maybe some of the first step for others, is sort of listening and understanding what would be most helpful.
So what I'd like to do, offer a few sort of summarizing remarks about the kinds of things I've heard, and then offer each of our panelists an opportunity to offer any summary or additional remarks. And then we'll invite Andrew Doris, our organizer, to join us and offer maybe a few more questions. And as long as we still have 80 plus people here, so I don't want to cut it down to the smaller forum where we can only handle 20. But again, we're happy to go on for a bit more. So the things that I've heard in terms of grappling with this broader issue of the seemingly greater risk of investing in systems change versus how do you keep track of how well you're doing. I think in some ways, it's more than semantic. That Ford's division, looking at it, is no longer called the monitoring and evaluation unit. It's the strategy and learning, and that really it is a strategic issue, and it's focused on learning. It's not, are they doing what they said they would do, and what are the outputs, and how does that correspond to the theory of change that was originally presented? And really what I hear from all of you, it's a shared grappling with your partners in defining the problem and how best to approach it, and how to assess it in an ongoing way. And that it's really an ongoing conversation about the shared questions that informs how you assess your progress, both in a project, in an organization, initiative, and really foundation wide. You're all leaders in this in terms of flexible funding, or what's often termed unrestricted funding. And there's another panel right now with some colleagues of ours on this very issue of what's been dubbed enterprise capital. And you're all in for the long term. I mean, Maya's slightly different because it's a bridge, but it's a bridge to a longer term engagement that you're playing a role in. But again, that, as you well know, is an exception rather than a rule in philanthropy in terms of long-term investment. And that failure is really redefined as how do we learn best? And you learn from when things work well, and you learn when things don't go the way you thought. And certainly we'd rather things go well. But failure is an opportunity for learning, and how do you fold that in from the beginning to be sure to capture that, so that this ecosystems, as some of you put it, approach captures the big players, the smaller players, and creates a context for ongoing learning and sharing and folding in what we've learned to the next iteration, whether it's foundation planning or implementation of an initiative with the government of Tanzania on early childhood education. So I think all of that is great, and we've advanced things, at least in my mind. So let me give you each a chance to make some final comments. Why don't we say Norma, Maya, Subarna, and then again, we're happy to stay on if people want to continue the conversation.
Thanks, Tony. I think that, as you said, we all have, we have a lot in common, and not coincidentally. But I think that if we think about the field of philanthropy in general, one thing I'd observe, and I'm interested if this course resonates with others, is that philanthropy is actually doing pretty well, I think, on the risk of something not having impact. Not perfectly, but I see a lot of different kinds of institutions, and both institutions that are focused on systems change and on tangible, immediate outcomes for people, being willing to do things like, Gates invested billions of dollars in building factories for vaccines that we didn't for COVID, before we even knew if they would work. We see a lot of the sort of test, pilot, fail fast experience ideas coming out of Silicon Valley. We see the effective altruist movement willing to invest in things like, might we get hit by an asteroid that they know most likely won't happen, but they think there's a big payoff if it does. But I think that what I do see holding us back is funders who are, much less interested in sort of joint lending with grantees, and much more, we want to talk about tangible outcomes, being really struggling with the risk of not ever knowing whether something is going to work. So, it's one thing to say we're going to do this and we might know we fail. It's another thing to say we're going to invest in trying to change norms or change systems, and we just don't know both whether our dollar tipped the balance, but also, what really happened if we're doing something like flexible support. So I'm hoping if we come back to what I was talking about around the sort of foreign intelligence analyst model and thinking sort of more robustly and quantifiably, and sometimes even externally verifying whether we're likely to have certain impact. I'm just sort of curious about if that sort of tools would make more other funders who are more focused on measurable outcomes more comfortable taking smart risks with things like systems change and with things like flexible support. I think the final thing I'll say about that is that we at Hewlett often are in partnership with grantees around shared learning, but we do have times when, I have questions about, are we really on track for something, that are not necessarily questions that our partners are asking or in quite the same way. And I do find that, that these sorts of tools are helpful in terms of asking these questions, really sort of drawing on contextual knowledge and thinking about how likely we are, sometimes in a quantitative way, to achieve certain outcomes, both when they're done in partnership with grantees, but sometimes even when we're doing them ourselves.
Yeah, I think, I think we covered a lot of ground today. And I think the only thing I would like to leave is a point around this question of impact and risk and impact is, it is a measurement question. And I think an important thing for us to keep in mind in this conversation is that there is, just like there is a subjective and objective side of risk, there is a subjective and objective side of measurement. And that's basically the difference between performance and success. So measuring performance, right? Measuring those tangible outputs, how many meals were generated, how many kids went through the program, how many vaccines were distributed. Like, there is value in that. There is value in performance. Where things get tricky in declaring impact is, I think, much closer to whether that performance has reached the threshold of success. And success is the subjective side, right? And I like to use the analogy, again, keep it simple financially. You invest in something, you expect 5% return, you get 3% return, that's a failure. You invest in something you expect, invest in something you expect 3% return, but you get 5% return, that's a wild success. The performance was actually identical in both scenarios, but because your expectations were different in the beginning, those expectations, which were informed by your assessment of risk, the same performance is either deemed a success or a failure. And I think that's what Norma and a lot of the conversation is getting to today, which is if we get too tied up into the expectation side of impact and risk, then it is too easy, right, to have that situation where performance and success find themselves at odds, whereas sort of just focusing on, again, learning from performance and being sure that next year that 5% turns into 7%, or, or whatever the analogy is, serves us much better in the long run.
Thank you. Subarna?
Yeah, just a wonderful conversation, and I'm taking away a lot as well. So just thank you to everyone, particularly Maya, Norma, and Tony. The thing I'm left with is maybe picking up just off of Maya's last comments is there's that subjective, objective side, and it's the interpretation of that by those in power who do get to interpret what is success that we're really thinking about, right? And the what we think will work for a population that we are often not a part of, if ever we are a part of, adequately representing, is the thing that I think a lot of our forward program staff, certainly we are asking at OSL, Office of Strategy and Learning, and that is, and the classic, bed nets for malaria example that are used as fishing nets comes to mind. Success might have been for the programmers to say, yes, malaria wasn't the thing that was solved for. But if you're looking at the, if you were to ask those who are using the nets for things that they deemed most urgent, that might be constituted as success in their eyes. And so there is such an interpretive and, to Maya's point, subjectivity to all of this that I think, and that is interlaced with power, that I think the more we just constantly push ourselves to ask the why question, it's what I often leave these conversations with.
Thank you. So I'd like to invite Andrew Doris to join us on our virtual stage. Andrew is a student at the Jackson Institute of Global Affairs and is also a Mets fan, which some of us appreciate compared to those darn Yankees. So Andrew is sort of like the power behind the curtain and deserves a great round of applause for conceiving and pulling together and helping create this panel. So Andrew, maybe it's good to say, what questions have we not addressed that you might like to pose?
So you've addressed an awful lot, and this is much too much to bite off in once. Thank you all for what I thought was a wonderful panel. The one thing I'm left with, and maybe we can try and keep our responses brief in case we want to shift over to that networking session where some of the audience may want to questions, was when you're using philanthropy to change policy or to influence thinking around policy, how do you factor in the humble risk that you might, or your organization might just be wrong on the policy question, right? Like there's another panel going on right now about criminal justice reform. I know Hewlett does work on neoliberalism. There's a lot of controversial issues where smart people can disagree. And it seems then you have to not only just have the risk of, is this project going to accomplish its objective, but if it does, how likely is it to actually improve the world? Maybe the other smart people who disagree with me are right. How confident do you have to feel as an organization to justify those risks when there's so much good you could reliably do instead? And then also, are there some types of policy issues that may lend themselves more to that type of philanthropy than others? To anybody, no one in particular.
Thanks, Andrew. Really thoughtful question. I think I would come back to what I and others talked about earlier around flexible support and around sort of supporting local organizations. So, for example, you mentioned that Hewlett has some work around reimagining what capitalism should look like and replacing the paradigm of neoliberalism with something else, which could totally reshape tax policy, how we think about climate change, all sorts of things. And we don't pretend to have the answer of what that looks like. And so it's much more, the work we're doing is much more around seeding a field of individuals who are thinking about what new paradigm should exist And then if that's successful, how to propagate it. And once again, plenty of chances for things to go wrong there, but having this more work around sort of seeding a field of people with diverse ideas who are going to challenge each other and maybe put out competing ideas means that the risk is different than if we were, and I would argue lesser than if we were trying to come up with the solutions ourselves. I do think that there are certain kinds of, if one is doing more directive policy work, that there are certain kinds of things that are very deeply about cultural norms and context versus more technocratic solutions that one should think about differently and play less than if one is being more hands-on in terms of cultural based issues.
Maya, responses, thoughts?
I would just go back to, I do think this is one of those places where values is key. And the reality is that not every human on the planet has the same values. It just doesn't. And so I don't think when you get down to those core points, it's very difficult to change people's views. And so there is no right and wrong unless you're on the side that you support.
Okay.
So, Barn, anything you'd like to add?
Maya and Norma. Yeah.
All right. What I would propose, since there are still 51 people in the room, is why don't we shift over to that link that I have posted to the top of the chat. Can everyone see that? And then anyone might be who's interested can follow us there, and hopefully continue the conversation. Thank you all. This is a success.
Thank you.
You are muted, Tony.
Thank you.
Before we break, deep thank you to Maya, to Norma, to Subarna for engaging with us in this. It's been very educational, I think, for everybody, and we look forward to keeping in touch. And thank you to Andrew for orchestrating this. So see you in the chat for a bit. We just have a few minutes before the 1 o'clock keynote. Thank you again.
Bye-bye.